feel like whenever I think about the 70s, I can't help but think about disco and the stuff people wore back then. And it's really not hard to see why, considering that the 70s is still referenced in pop culture decades later. So everybody buckle in, because I'm going to take you all the way back to the past. Back when Donna Summer was topping the charts and Studio 54 was the place to be. So finding the origins of disco is a little challenging because it spans several different countries and several different decades. What is considered the birth of disco was Swing Kids, a classic youth movement dedicated to jazz and outrageous fashion as a reaction to Nazi discipline that took off in Germany in 1939. A lot of people consider this the start of disco because at their underground parties, people used to dance to records chosen by a disc jockey. And these swing kids weren't exclusive to Germany either. Other European countries like France took part in the subculture too. But the disco as we know it has Regine Zilberberg and Chez Regine to thank. She installed a dance floor with colored lights and 2 turntables so she could play records without having a gap in the music. Disco also traveled overseas, making its way to America through the press, documenting the European disco scene. Soon, up-tempo music genres like soul, funk, Motown, and go-go were experiencing a rise in popularity. The birth of disco stateside is usually credited to DJ David Mancuso, who used to throw private dance parties at his home that eventually became known as The Loft. Underground disco such as The Loft provided a safer space for marginalized communities to party and dance without fear of being harassed or excluded because of their identity. Black, brown, Latinx, and queer communities were big champions of and embraced disco in particular. The video Disco Changed Everything, So Why Did It Die by AJ Plus explains in particular how the Stonewall riots shaped the disco culture. In short, a lot of laws and regulations about American nightlife, like bans against same-sex dancing, were relaxed after the riots, which caused a boom in nightlife and consequently discos. Disco did eventually reach mainstream popularity in the mid to late 70s when popular disco songs started topping the charts. With the movie Saturday Night Fever premiering in 1977, which was a huge success and had one of the best-selling soundtracks of all time, and with clubs like Studio 54 opening around the same time, disco ended up taking the world by storm. Now let's see what some people were wearing on a night out at the disco. I love the 70s as a decade of fashion a lot because we see a lot of innovation and creative expression in this decade. You know, it was a decade where it was normal to see women wear jeans for a lot of occasions. Hemlines were constantly changing. Men were still coming off the Peacock Revolution, so fashion was really out there. Like, it was just great. It was amazing. When I think of disco, I think of Donna Summer, Sequins, and just overall glamour. And I think that's a fair description because a lot of people went to the disco to partake in a night of glamour and fantasy. It was pure escapism, and they obviously needed the clothes to go with it. And while there are so many different movements and fashion trends that went on in the 70s, for this video, I'll just be focusing on disco fashion only. So let's see what everybody was wearing on a night out at the town. The wrap dress actually goes back to the early 20th century when designers like Elsa Schiaparelli and Claire McCardell had their own versions in the 30s and 40s. However, there was also something called the Hooverette that had a similar silhouette that was also popular in the 40s. It wasn't until the 1970s, though, when Diane von Furstenberg designed her own version of the wrap dress that we saw something that more resembles current versions of it. Her reinterpretation of the dress was made of a jersey material that clung to the body and was shorter in length with full-length sleeves. This allowed for ease of movement while also being a very feminine garment. The term hot pants was first used by Women's Wear Daily in 1970 to describe shorts made in luxury fabrics such as velvet or satin for fashionable wear. but eventually transformed to mean shorts that are extremely short. In 1971, Brooklyn Museum fashion curator Dorothy Tricario told the New York Times that hot pants were a response to an increase in nostalgia from the 30s and 40s. To be more specific, it was a nod to Hollywood stars like Betty Grable and Ruby Keeler that used to pose in short shorts. These shorts were very popular in the 70s, with many different brands like Yves Saint Laurent, Bessie Johnson, and Sears taking part in the trend as well. And while hot pants were mostly targeted towards women, men also wore the style. Sequins actually have a lot of history, with them being popular in the 17th to 19th centuries. They also experienced a revival in the 1920s when King Tut's tomb was discovered and his clothes were found to have sequins, and consequently kicked off a wave of Egyptomania. However, by the end of the 60s, the Supremes pretty much popularized this trend, paving the way for other musicians and other icons in the 70s. When disco fever took hold, dressing in outlandish and bold clothing was in, so it's no surprise that sequins were also a part of it. The way they reflected light, like a mini disco ball, pretty much became a sort of symbol for disco and the 70s. It also made its way into the 80s and has stuck around for decades since, usually as a club or party staple or a New Year's Eve number. A jumpsuit is a slim-fitting garment that covers the arms and legs, and at its inception, it was used by parachuters to jump from planes in, hence the name jumpsuit. In the 1930s, can you see a pattern here? Elsa Schiaparelli created her own stylish jumpsuits, but it wasn't until the 60s when it became popular day and evening wear. By the 60s and 70s, jumpsuits reached their peak, and they were worn in every way possible, from sportswear to more casual styles in the day, and more embellished and experimental material by night, making them extremely versatile and perfect disco wear. And while women mostly wore the style, jumpsuits were unisex and were also worn by men. Stars like Cher, Donna Summer, and Elvis were partial to the jumpsuit, making them a part of their signature style. The 70s in general was just a really fun time for suits. Because of the Peacock Revolution, it was more acceptable for men to wear bold prints, bright colors, and different fabrics. But today I want to talk about the leisure suit that was popularized by Saturday Night Fever and popular among men that went to the disco. These suits were usually made of synthetic materials like polyester and were often found in bright colors or bold patterns. Leisure suits were casual suits that usually had a shirt-like jacket and matching pants. The leisure suit consisted of a suit jacket that had a wide collar and lapels, and it wasn't uncommon for the pants to flare out at the leg. As the years went on, the style did receive backlash and they gradually fell out of style. And despite the 80s being known for women dressing in power suits, women actually did wear suits frequently in the 70s too. Since more women were entering the workforce, they took styling cues from men, and pantsuits exploded in popularity. And Diane Keaton as Annie Hall inspired a trend for layered menswear in 1977. And they were even worn to the disco, like this famous photo of Bianca Jagger. Seen in the 1930s on many formal or evening gowns. The top saw a resurgence in the 1940s, but this time as a swimsuit top worn by Hollywood starlets at the time. When the style came back in the 60s and 70s because of the counterculture movements, many women decided to do away with the girdle and the bra, and the halter top became a certified trend. It was also very easy for people to make their own halter tops through bandanas, scrap fabric, and scarves tied together. They were very easy to dress up and down depending on the style you wanted to achieve, and many celebrities at the time, like Cher and Goldie Hawn, also participated in this trend. I love this one a lot because it seems so modern to me, considering how big tube tops were in the 90s and early 2000s. But the tube tops were actually a pretty big fad in the 1970s as well. They came in a variety of different colors, patterns, and lengths, and were quintessential disco wear. Bell bottoms or flare jeans rose in prominence in the 1960s and 1970s and are a style of pants that gradually become wider from the knee down, forming a bell-like shape, hence the name. Sonny and Cher are usually credited with helping popularize the style because they wore it in their popular TV show. They were typically made from denim but also came in a variety of fabrics like satin and polyester. They were also usually paired with platforms, as the legs usually came past a lot of people's feet. They also were unisex, being enjoyed by both men and women at the time. As the decade of extravagant and subversive fashion, this definitely came as no surprise and were also staples on the dance floor. Obviously, these trends aren't end-all be-all, and I'm sure I haven't included many things. I'm sure there were people who wore many outlandish and amazing ensembles, and plenty of people who wore simple clothes. I guess the appeal to disco for me is that you could express yourself in a way you chose, and it was celebrated in that space. I feel like disco is usually treated like a fad or like a distant fever dream from the people that experienced it. For those of us who haven't, it's kind of like a party that we, keep hearing about, but we were never invited to. I would honestly say that disco still lives on today. Obviously not to the same extent, but in our references, our fashion trends, the music we listen to, and the fact that we still go out to clubs and party all night long. So in that sense, it's kind of like the party never ended. Let me know what your favorite trend was, and I'll see you guys in the next one.